So in Module 6, we're now going to look at the diversity in family life and then the issue of divorce when marriages don't quite go the distance. So let's go ahead and first look at the diversity in family life. Now we know a majority of adults in the ages between 18 to 29 are unmarried. They're usually busy preparing for careers, or they're kind of getting the careers off the ground and building social networks. So they may not feel like they're truly ready yet to go ahead and commit and start to have children and get married. We also have the issue of childless couples. And what we see here with childless couples is that they do tend to have just as satisfying, maybe more satisfying marriages, but it is, of course, without children. And that is one choice that couples can make. As I was saying, single adults tend to be the most prevalent in adulthood, and those go into different types of single adults, those who just never marry at all. But we talked about that's not too many of them, with 90% of people choosing to marry. You do have those that do cohabitation. These are couples who live together and marry. Those who do that cohabitate and marry, they do seem to have a higher level of dissatisfaction than those that have not lived together before getting married. So at least in the United States, it's a little different when we get into Europe and kind of what they find with cohabitation over there. But in the US, cohabitating tends to not be a successful strategy for long-term relationships to stick together. And then, of course, what we'll be talking a little bit more about in this module when divorce actually occurs. So as far as families that have both members, both parents working, we see that dual career couples are usually able to enjoy the personal and financial benefits of working without compromising their children's development. So that's a good thing. In other words, seeing mothers work, fathers work is associated with real positive outcomes. Though there is this spillover effect, and that's the way where events at work can affect the home life, and then events at home carry over the workplace. And you're going to see some of that too. Obviously, there's a lot of stressors that can occur in either setting, and it's hard to just shut that off and compartmentalize and go into the next one. So that can have an influence. Sometimes that influence is too much to overcome, and you begin to see divorce. So divorce is not a single incident. It is rather a series of stressful experiences for the entire family. And it usually begins with marital conflict even before the divorce occurs, and then includes a whole kind of complex of life changes afterwards. So a minimum of usually a full year when we talk about kind of the divorce process. Now, couples at higher risk of divorce typically are young adults in their 20s and 30s who've been married an average of about 7 years. Also, those who got pregnant before marriage, because then it seems like the marriage was not necessarily as much of a choice, but a more obligation. Those who are married in their teen years are at much higher risk because, frankly, we still are evolving quite a bit into our 20s and 30s. And to hook your ladder to an individual that you met in high school, there's inevitably going to be some growth and change and maybe distancing at that some point. If most of you think back to who your high school boyfriend or girlfriend was and a picture being married to them now, most of us would shake our head and say, "Whew, no, that would not have been good." And that's usually what happens. So let me go back before we get into post-crisis. Okay. So usually when you're in divorce or have finally gotten divorced, the signing of the paper is just one little part of it. It usually lasts a year or two, and it puts both people that are involved with the divorce at risk for depression. Not surprisingly, I mean, it's a huge psychological blow whether you're the one that wanted out or not. And so the parents are suffering, and they have their own kind of collapse and sense of failure and other things that are going on there. And then you have the impact on children. And children in general take a lot of it to heart, and especially depending on their age, they may not understand why, and they may begin to feel guilty in some ways. or angry and fearful. A lot of times the custodial mother is overwhelmed, and it's overwhelmingly the custodial mother, unless there's joint custody, but rarely do fathers get sole custody. And they feel overwhelmed because, of course, if they haven't been working, they have to find work. If they have been working, they have the same stressors, except now there's no one to share that load with. And so you can imagine how overwhelmed that's going to mean, meaning that they're not going to be able to spend as much time with their children, because maybe they're balancing all these other needs. They may not be as nurturing because they're more stressed. And so you can see that a lot of things going on. Children will start to display maybe behavior problems, because once again, it's not the system. Remember, we talked at the beginning of this chapter that the family is a system. And when you talk about divorce, you get a system like this and you rip it apart. And this doesn't work, right? It takes a while for it to kind of get functioning again and not have this part involved as much anymore. And so part of that transition is some behavioral problems. You're also not going to see as much oversight or supervision on the custodial parent's part because they have so many other duties. And so once again, behavior problems can result. It could be also a manufacture of the manifestation of anger and such. Peer relationships often suffer and change because children just don't feel like their friends can relate and understand in the same way. And so they may distance themselves to some degree. And there could be very large lasting effects. We know even into children of divorce are more likely to get divorced themselves, even though they state that they would rather not get divorced, and that they are getting married later because their fear of divorce. And yet at the same time, they are more likely to do that. It takes usually a year or two to readjust, to have that system kind of readjust to its own little bit. And the problem is, as soon as it happens, there's going to be oftentimes remarriage of that parent. And so within 3 to 5 years of divorce, 75% of single parent families are going to experience yet another change in the fact that the parent remarries, and then the children are going to acquire a step parent. So even though negative effects can disappear over the next couple of years, some children are negatively impacted by their own distress and the breakdown in parenting, so they have a persistent problem that can carry on into adulthood. So the influence on adult or on divorce adjustment, adequate financial support. Like, did you have to move out of your house when your parents got divorced? So did you have to change to a whole new setting? Probably a less affluent one. Is there good parenting by custodial and non-custodial parents? Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they hate each other's guts, and you get to be the go-between, or the not really. It's more of a power struggle, and you're just going to be caught up in one of those pawns in trying to get back at the other spouse, which of course is not very good. Is there minimal conflict between parents? That's always better. I had one student in a class a while back. She said she had to be the go-between. Her parents wouldn't talk to one another after they got divorced, so she had to be the conduit for their communications. I mean, can you imagine a child having to have that sort of pressure put on them? It's not good. Was there additional social support so that families had somebody to rely upon when times started getting tough? Were there otherwise minimal changes, or were there a whole uprooting of your social network because of some of the financial issues? And then what are the personal resources of those individuals? Do they have some good resiliency factors, or are they really trying to just struggling and not having that? So never a pleasant thing to discuss, but certainly having ramifications well beyond the actual divorce. So in our last module, we're going to talk about family violence and abuse. Never a pleasant topic, but one we certainly need to be aware of and take issue with if we ever do see or hear of it. So that's going to wrap up our chapter, and we start on module 7, and that's up next. So stay tuned.